Hi, my name is Megan Bray, and this is my recording for my Strand project for Education 323, teaching elementary and middle school math. For my Strand project, I selected to do numbers and number sense, which connects to the Virginia Standard of Learning 3.2 regarding fractions. In the standard, students will be required to name and write fractions and mixed numbers represented by models. So they will be presented with a model, and they will have to not only verbally say the name of the fraction, they will also have to write the name of the fraction or mixed number. Then they will have to move on to representing the fraction themselves. So they will be given the verbal name of it or written form of it, and they'll have to create the model of that fraction. And lastly, the hardest part of the standard is the comparing of the fractions with like and unlike denominators. They will be given models to be able to look at and compare which one has a greater value or a lesser value. And they will use the traditional comparison symbols and equal signs to show that comparison. The essential questions with this strand are: what is a fraction? What is more than just the numbers on top of each other? What is it trying to show us? What's the purpose of it? Why do we need them? Then why is it important to be able to compare fractions? This is that real word connection of, okay, outside of the math classroom, why do we need this? What are we going to use it for? As they look at comparing the fractions, if you have the two fractions, what is it that you're looking at to see the value, and how does that connect to that number that they'll be using later? And the vocabulary essential question is, what do the numerator and denominator tell us? Why do we need them? What do those terms mean? They'll start with a note-taking graphic organizer of making the anchor chart of ways to represent fractions. A lot of times students only see fractions as one way. Normally the parts of a whole is the most obvious one they use. But at third grade, we want them to be able to see that there's lots of different ways that you're going to see fractions being modeled and represented, and to be able to utilize all of these different models. Throughout the unit Strand project and throughout the Strand, they'll be exposed to multiple different books. They'll start with this one called Jump Kangaroo Jump, which is introducing the idea of fractions through a very vivid and real-world application of a field day. These animals are going through different field day activities, even as simple as having to divide up and being able to see how these things that they've experienced still connect to fractions. They'll also have the one called the Lion's Share, which is a great also social emotional connection book where the students learn about kindness and sharing and what happens when we don't. And at the start of the book, the animals come to dinner with the lion, and they're rude and they're selfish, and they take all the food, whereas when they get to dessert and they cut their cake, Mouse has ended up with very little and Lion ends up with none. And they learn and see that when we are dealing with fractions, it's smaller than what we sometimes think, as they learn the importance of caring for others and sharing. And they'll end with this introduction to reducing fractions with fractions in disguise, as our main character discovers that just because a fraction's divided up into pieces doesn't mean that it has to be the way it always is. And he'll find that there are some fractions like 10 over 15 that really is in disguise and could be cut into less pieces to end up with 2/3. For the science integration, we'll be looking at soil, which is one of the third grade standards for science 3.7, where they have to understand that there are multiple components of soil and different layers to the soil. So we'll focus on the idea that soil is made up of topsoil, subsoil, and bedrock as an introduction to the second substandard for this science. And they will actually make a cup of edible soil using different elements. And throughout there, we'll look at the fractions of the fraction. They'll be able to name the fractional piece of how much is Oreos, how much is chocolate chips. But they also can make the connection of actually looking at real soil and the fact that real soil isn't divided up evenly. So we can't name a fractional piece of it until we do divide it up evenly, because the majority of soil is that subsoil piece of it, which is much larger than the small layer of topsoil that's at the top. For social studies integration, we'll be looking at Social Studies Virginia SOL 3.12, which talks about the different levels of the government. And we'll start on focusing on the U.S. government and looking at the 3 branches. And we'll be able to see that each branch makes up 1/3 of the government. and the responsibilities, and deciding if the responsibilities are divided up equally. Can we name it as a fraction as they go through? For the tiered activities, for the below grade level readers, we'll actually be making pizza. Food, when you connect it a little bit to food, it makes everyone a little bit happier. But for their food, they will start with making their pizza. So we'll have the fun piece of it where they will take a regular paper plate and they'll glue on their red construction paper for their tomato sauce. They'll get to pick their different pre-cut toppings and glue those on. Then we'll get into the fractional piece of it where they'll fold their pizza in half because they need to share it, and they'll cut it and look at how the two pieces and how many are you having? You have one, but there's two total, so you have one half. Then if the students understand that, you can continue to take it deeper and have them cut it into fourths because you want to share it with 4 people. As they look at the fourths, they can even begin to develop the understanding that 2/4 was the same as 1/2. So if I eat 2 pieces of it, I ate the same amount. For our grade level students, we're going to be using M&Ms and looking at the idea that part of a whole, the whole is going to remain the same. For a lot of students, they always feel like the whole has to vary with the part. So we will look at this and we'll start by looking at the fact that how many total M&Ms do you have? This is your whole. This has to stay the same unless you give more M&Ms in. And through the small group lesson, they'll work on different colors and making the fractions. If they're understanding this, you can even dive in a little bit deeper and talk about adding it. If we put blue and green together, what's the fraction? Well, what does that look like with the number piece of it? They also can look at the size of the fractions. Which one do I have more of? How do I know that fraction's bigger? What part of the number, the written piece of the fraction, makes it look larger? And then for above grade levels, we're going to actually start pushing them towards Virginia SOL Standard 4.2, dealing with fractions, which is where they have to order the fractions. So they'll start with dominoes, pulling out 5 dominoes and naming the fractions. And then we'll start comparing them 2 at a time in order to get them to the point where they can line them up in a row and see the order from smallest to greatest of those dominoes and those fractions. For our assessments, the first formative assessment will be a craft making a paper ice cream sundae. To help save time and to make sure the students don't get bogged down in the cutting piece of it, the teacher can have the bowl of the sundae and the scoops already pre-cut out for them so they can just select their colors that they choose and then decorate their scoops. Depending on the teacher's creativity, they can give them extra supplies like glitter or pre-cut out little papers to help decorate, or they can just use markers or colored pencils to decorate their scoops. And then as the fractional piece of this, on the bowl itself, they will write down what are the fractions of their ice cream scoops. For the second one, they'll be putting together puzzle pieces. So they will be presented with up to 32. I would not give all students 32. I would put them in groups of maybe 5 groups and divide up 6 of the puzzles to each group. But in these puzzles, we're really working on that idea that fractions can be represented with multiple models. So they will be given a number fraction and then 3 models, and they will have to connect them all together to show that they're all showing the same model. For the summative one, we're actually going to use a quizzes digital technology connection. And I love using quizzes because it helps with test anxiety because they're not worrying about the paper test, but it also gives them redemption questions so that if they made a simple mistake, they get a chance to redeem themselves. For the lesson plan, we're going to start by using the Kangaroo Jump book. So we'll set this lesson up with the idea of field day. The teacher will go through the book and pointing out the models as they go. For the guided practice, they'll use the fraction manipulatives as the teacher gives different fractions for them to show and to gauge their understanding. And then they will complete a worksheet where they will be given models and they have to name the correct fraction. The big idea for the whole strand is the fact that they're going to be able to identify models and correctly write them with their numerator and denominator. And they need this so that they can know how to divide up into groups when they have a game at recess. And they will know that they've got it when they can take a picture model during the independent practice and correctly state the fraction. So as we look through our unpacking, our big things they need to be able to do is name, write, represent, and compare. And you can see on the graphic organizer how they all connect into helping the students be able to complete the standard.